I feel like I'm beginning to lose my mind. It's only been 5 days since the last log, but so much has happened. I feel like I need to record the events. I had lost contact with Tower 7, with Peter, 2 nights ago. His last few messages to myself and Katie were strange. He told us that he was hearing voices coming from outside of his tower. Whispers, beckoning him to come outside. He said that no matter where he was inside the tower, the voices would always sound like they were right next to him. He said he took everything that wasn't bolted down and stacked it in front of the large shattered window and door. He attempted to contact anyone on the emergency frequency, though received no reply. When he told us this, we each tried to do the same, and it was in that moment that we realized all 3 of us were alone out here. The evening before Peter's radio went silent, he was saying that he could hear heavy footsteps ascending the tower. They'd rattle off the metal steps and get right up to the tower's platform before stopping. He said when he looked out of the window, he couldn't see anyone standing there. He asked us what he should do, and honestly, we didn't have an answer for him. We could hear his increasing distress through the crackling receiver, but we were at a loss. His radio went silent shortly after that. Both Katie and I tried contacting him over and over again, but every time, no response was heard from Tower 7. I had considered packing up a bag and hiking through the forest to his tower. However, every time I stepped outside and looked down at the trees below, I'd turn around and go back inside. I felt terrible every time I tried to attempt it and failed. If this had happened on the first day, I would already be on my way over to his tower. But after experiencing what I had been for the past 2 weeks, my brain couldn't push my body down those steps. Yesterday morning, I spent hours just standing on the small ledge outside my tower door, using my binoculars to look over at Tower 7. Even though it had always been fairly difficult to spot from my position, looking at the structure now, it just seemed lifeless, like looking at an abandoned building. I spent the afternoon speaking with Katie in Tower 9. She had been growing more and more concerned with each passing hour. She had been oblivious to the things both Peter and I had witnessed. She couldn't understand what was happening. Hell, I barely understood it myself. She kept asking me for advice on what we should do about Tower 7, and much like with Peter, I didn't really have an answer. The best I could muster was to tell her to remain in her tower, and that we'll keep trying to contact Tower 7. Even though I could hear defeat in her voice, she agreed. Hours passed and the sun began to fall from the sky. With night growing on the horizon, a chill swept through the area. It was far colder this night than any other night previously. I began to stack whatever I could in front of the door to my tower. I wasn't entirely sure what I'd be preparing for, or if something like this would work, but doing this provided a bit of relief to my nerves. As I sat there huddled in the corner with a small lamp at my side and my gun within reach, I stared off through the window, trying to remain alert. At roughly midnight, something happened. I felt my head beginning to nod as I was struggling to keep my eyes open, when the radio crackled for a second. I felt my eyes shoot open, not entirely sure if I truly heard something. The crackling returned a second time and I walked over to it. I picked up the receiver and asked if it was Peter. A long 5 minutes passed. The silence in the air was so heavy that the ticks from my watch sounded like a hammer on metal. A voice spoke through the radio, and when I heard it, I dropped the receiver and backed away. The voice was faint and distant, and yet at the same time, it felt like the voice was right behind me, speaking into my ear. It said,
"I can see you."
I backed up across the length of the tower until my back pressed up against the cold glass of the window. I felt my breathing become shallow. I had never heard a voice like that before, and it clearly wasn't Peter. I turned and looked in the direction of Tower 7, though it was impossible to see it in the dark. I was at a loss for words and actions. I slid down to the floor and sat there looking at the now silent radio. I stayed like this for nearly an hour. I thought about walking over and attempting to contact Katie, but I couldn't force myself to move from the spot. The minutes were ticking by and I was longing for sunrise to crest over the trees. That's when I heard a sound coming from outside the tower. The sound of heavy footfalls on each step leading up to the top. I could feel my pulse beginning to quicken, and the thrum of my heartbeat began to sync up with each deliberate step. The steps seemed to reverberate endlessly. Then, when they grew the loudest at the top of the stairs, they stopped. I stood up and looked through the window across the tower. There was nothing there. A million things were racing through my mind, wondering who or what could have been making that noise. I waited, and no more footsteps came. It would have been foolish for me to think this was a product of my imagination at this point. I could clearly hear those footsteps drawing closer and closer. There was definitely something outside of my tower. As I stood in silence, trying to mentally prepare myself for something to happen, I heard a new sound. A sharp tick, tick, tick against one of the glass windows. I slowly turned. There was something hanging upside down from on top of the tower. Its head seemed to be floating in midair. Long, stringy black hair dangled from its scalp like a torn-up bedsheet. Its eyes were heavily sunken into its face, and they didn't seem to have any pupils. A twisted grin stretched from ear to ear. Teeth, like sharp, jagged rocks, infested its mouth. Long, bony fingers held this thing in place against the glass, fingers that were nearly as long as my forearm. It curled a single finger, rapping the nail against the glass over and over again. Despite my fear upon seeing this thing, I did notice that this creature didn't look like the one that had previously carried the lantern. Well, not entirely the same, that is. This one looked vicious, like it wanted to harm me, while the other one just seemed curious, if that makes any sense. It stared at me like a beast, stalking its prey. I could feel my throat begin to dry up and sweat begin to drop from my forehead. I eyed the shotgun resting on the ground near where I was previously sitting. Its teeth began to separate, revealing a slimy black tongue that licked across the glass. Strings of foul saliva dripped against it, nearly causing me to gag. It began tapping harder and harder on the glass. A moment later, my worst fear came to life. The window began to crack. It started where the finger was impacting, then began to branch out like a spiderweb until the entire pane was a brittle mess. One final tap, and the entire window shattered. When that happened, I felt my body jerk forward and I dove for the gun. I scooped it up with both hands and fired directly at the window. The sound left a harsh ringing in my ears that didn't subside for some time, and wafts of smoke filled the tower. A moment later, the smoke cleared, and I looked at the window. There was no sign of it anywhere. I had no idea if I had hit it or not. There didn't seem to be any indication left behind. My hands were trembling so badly as I held the gun, that the rattling of metal and wood was quickly overtaking the incessant ringing. I stood up and slowly walked over to the window. I looked around for a few moments, and once I was convinced it had gone, I looked over the ledge. When I did, I saw something large and dark disappearing into the trees, heading away from the tower. The sun eventually began to rise, and I could feel warmth returning to me after such a cold, terrible night. I contacted Katie and told her what had happened. She was in complete disbelief, and honestly, I don't blame her. I'm not sure what to do at this point. I doubt we're going to make it to the end of all this. I don't know how many more shells that thing can take, but my ammo will run out eventually, and then it will be too late. I can't stop thinking about Katie and how she could be next. It's an insane thought, I know, but I feel like I need to go to her, to help her. I don't know if I will write again, or if I'll even be here to write again. I'm going to take a day to gather my thoughts, and then I'm going to leave the tower to find Katie. If I don't write again, then it means I failed. And for that, I am sorry.